On January 20th, 1942, at 12 noon, 15 men sat down to lunch at a lakeside villa at Am Großen Wannsee, 56 to 58, in the southwestern suburbs of Berlin. Winter light came off the frozen lake and through the tall windows of a conference room of roughly 7 by 10 meters. The SS stewards brought coffee and cognac across parquet floors, and Reinhard Heydrich's office calendar recorded the meeting's duration as 90 minutes. The popular memory of what followed has hardened into a single image, a hidden wartime secret decided in one room kept from the population. The documentary record disagrees. The Reich Statistical Office under Dr. Richard Korher produced a published population register of the regime's Jewish persecution by March 1943. The Korher report, Russia Files, declassified between 1947 and 1948. The Wannsee Protocol itself was typed in a numbered series of 30 copies. Copy number 16 was found by United States prosecutor Robert Kempner in March 1947 in Foreign Office files in Berlin. It sits today at the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts under the file mark Inland 2G 177. This was not hidden. It was administered. The administration was old. April 1st, 1933. The first nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses, organized by Julius Streicher. September 15th, 1935. The Nuremberg race laws drafted at the Reichsparteitag. November 9th through 10th, 1938. Kristallnacht, with 267 synagogues attacked and approximately 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. September 21st, 1939. Heydrich's Schnellbrief to the Einsatzgruppen commanders ordered the concentration of Polish Jews into ghettos in cities with rail connections. July 31st, 1941, Hermann Göring's authorization letter to Heydrich used the phrase Gesamtlösung der Judenfrage. Each line in the cascade carries a date, a name, a place, a number. And the men in that room understood, when they stood up at 13:30, that the only remaining questions were of timetable, tonnage, and rail capacity. The Reich's racial state, the legal architecture built before a single deportation order. On April 7, 1933, 68 days after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, the Reich Civil Service law was published in the Reichsgesetzblatt, and a column of typed text on page 175 defined for the first time in German law who was no longer a German. The law had a polite name, the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. It was signed by Wilhelm Frick, Reich Minister of the Interior. The first paragraph removed political opponents. The third paragraph, the so-called Aryan paragraph, removed Jewish civil servants. The text was 9 pages long. The Reichsgesetzblatt issue is still on the shelf at the Bundesarchiv under Series R1501. This was the door. Within 12 months, every German Jew who taught at a state university, worked at a tax office, or drew a salary from a ministry had been processed out. There was no mob, there was a stamp. The mechanism of the stamp was a small folded booklet called the Ahnenpass, the genealogical certificate, which required the bearer to prove the religion of all 4 grandparents by producing parish baptism records going back to 1800. A whole new bureaucratic industry grew around the booklet. Printers in Munich and Leipzig issued standardized forms. Genealogical research bureaus opened in every German city. The civil registrars cooperated. The Lutheran and Catholic parish offices cooperated. The professional genealogists cooperated. The architecture was administrative before it was anything else. Then it became statutory. On September 15, 1935, at the Reichsparteitag in Nuremberg, 2 laws were rushed into final draft in less than 48 hours. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship. They became subjects of the state, a separate legal category. The law for the protection of German blood and honor forbade marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The implementing decree of November 14, 1935, fixed the classification line. 3 Jewish grandparents made a full Jew. 2 made a Mischling first degree. 1 made a Mischling second degree. The numbers were arithmetic. The men who did the arithmetic had names. Bernhard Lösner, the race expert at the Interior Ministry, drafted the technical thresholds. Hans Globke, a senior ministerial jurist, wrote the official legal commentary on the Nuremberg laws. Kommentar zur deutschen Rassengesetzgebung, published in 1936, that became the authoritative explanation distributed to every German court and registry office. Globke would survive the war. He would become Chief of Staff to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer from 1953 to 1963. The commentary stayed on the shelf. Inside the regime, the classification work was treated as a serious professional discipline. Junior jurists at the Interior Ministry were promoted on the strength of their grandparent trace files. The Race and Settlement Main Office issued certificates with embossed seals. The genealogical evidence was archived in card catalogues. Each card carried a name, a birth date, and a confessional designation. The cards survived the war in significant numbers and are held today across the Bundesarchiv branches in Berlin, Lichterfelde, Koblenz, and Freiburg. The foreign press was not asleep. Time, the New York Times, the Manchester Guardian, Le Temps, the Warsaw Nass Preglond, all carried Nuremberg Law's coverage in the autumn of 1935. The architecture was open, statutory, published, available in any newsroom on 3 continents. Here is the part the popular memory has compressed. The killing that the modern imagination attaches to a single place name, Auschwitz, began at the Interior Ministry typewriter 12 years earlier. The post-war consolidation of memory has collapsed those 12 years of incremental, codified ministerial machinery into a single shock image at the end of the line. The shock image is true. It is also the last frame of a much longer film. By the spring of 1938, German Jewish citizens had been removed from the civil service, the legal profession, medicine, journalism, education, and the officer corps. Their passports had been stamped with a red letter J on October 5, 1938, by order of the Reichsminister of the Interior. Their property had begun to be inventoried for Aryanization. Between 1933 and 1938, roughly 150,000 of Germany's approximately 525,000 Jews emigrated, leaving behind property, businesses, professions, and citizenship. The remaining 375,000 were inside a closing box. What had been a question of paragraphs and ministerial decrees would, within 48 hours of an assassination in Paris, become a question of broken glass. Kristallnacht, Madagascar, and the Moment policy became operational. In the autumn of 1939, in the occupied Polish city of Piotrków Trybunalski, the German military administration issued the first sealed ghetto order in Europe, and within 9 months the model had been replicated in 23 cities. The interval between Kristallnacht and that order had been 10 months and 3 weeks. Inside that interval, the regime's persecution of the Jewish population had crossed a line the racial laws of 1935 had not crossed. Kristallnacht itself, the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, was choreographed from the Reich Propaganda Ministry. 267 synagogues were attacked. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses had their windows broken. Roughly 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in the following 72 hours and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, where the released were ordered to emigrate within weeks. On November 12, 1938, in a meeting at the Reich Aviation Ministry chaired by Hermann Göring and recorded in a stenographic transcript later submitted at Nuremberg as document PS 1816, the regime imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the German Jewish community for the damage to its own buildings. The same meeting accelerated the seizure of Jewish-owned firms. The transcript runs over 100 pages. Göring's recorded sentence that the matter must be coordinated centrally one way or another became the procedural template for everything that followed. Then came the war. The Wehrmacht crossed the Polish frontier on September 1st, 1939. Behind the army moved 5 Einsatzgruppen of the security police and the SD. 3 weeks later, on September 21, 1939, Heydrich issued the Schnellbrief to the Einsatzgruppen commanders. The text is preserved as document PS 3363 in the Nuremberg series. It distinguished between an ultimate aim, to be kept strictly secret, and stages on the way, which could be communicated. The first stage was concentration. The order specified that Jewish populations in occupied Poland be moved into the urban centers, that the urban centers be selected for their existing rail connections, and that Jewish councils be established to administer the concentration. Piotrków Trybunalski was sealed in October 1939. Łódź followed, sealed on April 30th, 1940, with approximately 160,000 Jews confined inside. Warsaw was sealed on November 16, 1940, with roughly 400,000 Jews confined within 3.4 square kilometers behind a 3-meter brick wall built by Jewish forced labor at Jewish-funded expense. The Foreign Office, meanwhile, was drafting a separate plan. On July 3, 1940, Franz Rademacher, head of the Jewish Affairs Desk at the Auswärtiges Amt, produced a memorandum proposing the deportation of 4 million European Jews to the French colony of Madagascar after the defeat of Britain. The memorandum was discussed at the level of state secretaries. It assumed naval mastery of the Atlantic. By the late autumn of 1940, with the Battle of Britain lost and the Royal Navy unbroken, the Madagascar plan was no longer operationally serious. It remained, however, a documentary marker. Even in the summer of 1940, the working assumption inside the regime was deportation on a continental scale. What changed the scale was the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Behind the 3 Wehrmacht army groups moved 4 reorganized Einsatzgruppen, designated A, B, C, and D, totaling roughly 3,000 men under Otto Ohlendorf, Arthur Neber, Otto Rasch, and Walter Stahlecker. They were ordered to kill Soviet political commissars and Jewish men of military age. Within weeks, the operational situation reports radioed back to the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin began to describe the inclusion of women and children. The shift is datable. Operational Situation Report number 32, August 14, 1941. Operational Situation Report number 47, August 30, 1941. By Operational Situation Report number 101, dated October 2, 1941, the killings at Babi Yar on the ravine outside Kiev on September 29th and 30th were tallied at 33,771. The report was a typed daily bulletin produced in the building on the Prinz Albrecht Straße in Berlin. The full series of 195 Ereignismeldungen UdSSR sits at Bundesarchiv Berlin under R58. The bulletins were distributed in numbered carbon copies to approximately 70 recipients across the ministries, the Wehrmacht High Command, and the party chancellery. The distribution list survives. The recipients read what was being done. Then came the authorization letter. On July 31, 1941, Göring signed a 1-page document instructing Heydrich to prepare an overall plan for the Gesamtlösung of the Jewish question in Europe. The phrase translated in the typed form Eichmann would use 6 months later as final solution. The signature was real. The paper was real. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed an estimated 500,000 to 800,000 Jews in the occupied Soviet territories. The deaths were documented daily, by district, by named officer, by tallied number. They were also operationally unsustainable. Commanders were reporting psychological breakdowns among the shooting squads. Himmler, who watched a shooting operation outside Minsk on August 15, 1941, ordered his subordinates to find a different method. That logistical and psychological failure, as the men at the top would already be writing about by the late summer of 1941, was the problem that the meeting at Wannsee was called to solve. Wannsee, the 90 minutes that organized a continent. On January 20th, 1942, at 12 noon, in a requisitioned villa on the Wannsee, Reinhard Heydrich opened a 90-minute meeting whose typed protocol would be catalogued 48 years later as document Inland 2G 177. The villa had been seized from a Jewish industrialist named Friedrich Minu, by then in prison on unrelated fraud charges. It had a winter garden, a music room, and a dining room that the SS converted into a conference space. The 15 men around the table were not improvising. Heydrich had convened them on Göring's authority to coordinate ministries that were already overlapping. The Reich Security Main Office, the Foreign Office, the General Government, the Reich Ministry of the Interior, the Reich Ministry of Justice, the Race and Settlement Main Office, the Party Chancellery, the Reich Chancellery, the Eastern Ministry. The seating was hierarchical. The transcript was typed by Adolf Eichmann's office at the Reich Security Main Office on Kurfürstenstraße. Eichmann would testify in Jerusalem in 1961 that Heydrich was satisfied with the meeting's outcome and that the cognac came out after. The names around the table form a directory of the German ministerial state in its operational form. Wilhelm Stuckart, State Secretary at the Interior Ministry, present to defend the racial classification thresholds he had drafted. Roland Freisler, State Secretary at the Justice Ministry, the future President of the People's Court. Otto Hoffmann, Chief of the Race and Settlement Main Office. Josef Bühler, State Secretary of the General Government, who pressed Heydrich to begin the operation in occupied Poland because the infrastructure was already in place. Martin Luther, Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office. Erich Neumann from the Four-Year Plan. Friedrich Wilhelm Kritzinger from the Reich Chancellery. Heinrich Müller, Chief of the Gestapo. None of them objected. The protocol itself is 15 pages. The table on page 6 lists 11 million Jews by country. Germany, 131,800. France in the occupied zone, 165,000. France in the unoccupied zone, 700,000. England, 330,000. Ireland, 4,000. Switzerland, 18,000. Sweden, 8,000. Spain, 6,000. Portugal, 3,000. Turkey in Europe, 55,500. Hungary, 742,800. The table reached countries the Reich did not yet control and would never control. The intention was continental. The cover phrase was evacuation to the east, a euphemism the participants used because the killing centers were already under construction and the men in the room knew it. Chelmno had been operational since December 8, 1941, using converted Saurer and Magirus Deutz trucks. The trucks were 4.5 by 2 meters inside, sealed with engine exhaust piped into the cargo compartment. They could process up to 100 people per cycle. The system was inefficient and stressful for the operators, the same complaint that had ended the shooting model. The fixed installation solution was already being engineered. Bełżec opened in March 1942. Sobibor opened in May 1942. Treblinka opened in July 1942. The 3 Operation Reinhard sites were placed on the Lublin-Lwów rail axis, each with a single short spur line off a main track, each disguised behind fake station signage. Operation Reinhard itself would be named retroactively after Heydrich, killed by Czech and Slovak parachutists in Prague on June 4, 1942. The man who organized the operation on the ground was Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader at Lublin. The man who designed the killing center system was Christian Wirth, transferred to Globoknik's staff from the T4 program, the regime's earlier campaign against the disabled, where the carbon monoxide method had first been engineered. The continuity was personal, the same engineers, the same chemists, the same trucks. Now here is the part the post-war memory has misfiled. The Wannsee Protocol does not contain the word killing. It contains the word evacuation. The men in the room understood evacuation as a cover term. They were not deciding. They were coordinating. The decision had been taken earlier, in the cumulative chain of orders from the summer and autumn of 1941, in Hitler's recorded table talk, in the operational reports flowing daily into Berlin. Wannsee turned a multi-agency process into a single chain of command under the Reich Security Main Office. The minutes were typed in 30 copies. 29 were destroyed or never recovered. Copy number 16 was the one Robert Kempner pulled out of the captured Foreign Office files in March 1947. It was the Rosetta Stone of the post-war prosecution. Without it, the bureaucratic architecture of the killing system would have had to be reconstructed from 1,000 separate documents. With it, the architecture sat on a single typed sheaf. Kempner himself was a Jewish jurist born in Freiburg in 1899, dismissed from the Prussian Interior Ministry under the April 7, 1933 law, exiled to the United States, and returned in 1945 as a deputy chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg. He recognized the protocol at sight because he had once worked alongside men whose names appeared on its distribution list. The casualty count came from a separate document in a separate language on a different continent. On January 11, 1943, the British Signals Intelligence Station at Bletchley Park intercepted a coded German radio transmission from Lublin to Krakow. It was the Höfler telegram sent by Hermann Höfler, Globoknik's chief of staff. It listed the year-end 1942 cumulative deportee totals for the 4 Operation Reinhard sites, 1,274,166. The intercept was decrypted, filed, classified, and not read for context for 57 years. In 2000, the historians Peter Witt and Stephen Tyas located it in the declassified Bletchley files at the National Archives at Kew in series HW 16/23 and recognized what the number was. By the end of 1942, 11 months after the meeting at Wannsee, 1.27 million Jews had been killed in the Operation Reinhard camps alone, and the count itself was sitting on a British signals intercept slip on a shelf in southwest London. What was framed in the protocol's bureaucratic prose as evacuation to the east had already, by the time the conference broke up at 1:30, become a system of fixed sites, scheduled trains, and standing orders that no participant of that lunch needed to administer personally. The Reichsbahn, Drancy, and how the rails carried the continent. On March 27, 1942, Convoy No. 1 left the Le Bourget-Drancy station for Auschwitz with 1,112 men aboard, and the invoice for that train, marked at 4 Reichspfennig per kilometer per head, was paid by the Sicherheitsdienst 3 weeks later. This is the documentary fact that the popular imagination has the hardest time absorbing. The trains had a fare. The fare was set by the Reichsbahn, the German state railway, as a routine commercial transaction. The rate was 4 Reichspfennig per kilometer per deportee in third-class carriages. Children under 10 were charged half fare. Children under 4 travelled free. Group bookings of 400 or more received the group discount that any school excursion would have received. The invoices were typed, signed, stamped, and paid into Reichsbahn accounts. Many of them survive in the Bundesarchiv Berlin and were reproduced in Raoul Hilberg's research, first published in 1961 as The Destruction of the European Jews, revised in 2003. The Reichsbahn was a state enterprise of approximately 1.4 million employees in 1942. It was the largest single employer in occupied Europe. It made its money. The transport coordinator was Adolf Eichmann at RSHA Section 4B4. His representative in France was Theodor Dannecker, an SS Hauptsturmführer who would later serve in Bulgaria and Italy. In each occupied country, the local administrative apparatus was incorporated into the system. The French case is the best documented. On July 16th and 17th, 1942, French police under the command of René Bousquet, Secretary-General of the French National Police under the Vichy regime, carried out the Veldiv roundup in Paris. Over 36 hours, they arrested 13,152 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, and concentrated them at the Vélodrome d'Hiver, an indoor cycling stadium. The transports left for Drancy and then for Auschwitz. Of the children, almost none returned. The historian Serge Klaasfeld would spend 40 years reconstructing the French deportations name by name, convoy by convoy. Le Mémorial de la Déportation des Juifs de France, published in 1978 and revised through subsequent editions, established the total at 75,721 Jews deported from France between March 1942 and August 1944. Of those, 2,566 returned alive. The Klaasfeld figure is name by name, not estimated, not modelled. Reconstructed from the convoy lists held at the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine in Paris and from the records of the German Sicherheitsdienst office on the Avenue Foch. Each name carries a birth date, a last known address, a convoy number, and an Auschwitz arrival date when documented. The scale was continental. The Netherlands, approximately 102,000 Jews deported, of a pre-war population of 140,000. Belgium, approximately 25,000 deported. Greece, from Salonika, where the Jewish community had been established for 5 centuries since the expulsion from Iberia in 1492, the German authorities deported approximately 48,000 Jews between March and August 1943, almost the entirety of the community. The Salonika transports took 8 days on the rails. Norway, 772 deported. Italy, after the German occupation of the north in September 1943, approximately 7,500 deported. Yugoslavia, through the puppet states of Croatia and the German military administration in Serbia, figures in the tens of thousands. Hungary, The latest and the most concentrated of the operations, approximately 437,000 Jews deported between May 15th and July 9th, 1944. Local administrations supplied the lists. In the Netherlands, the Joodserraad, the Jewish council established under German order, compiled deportation rosters at German request. In France, the UGYF, the Union Générale des Israélites de France, played a similar role under coercion. The collaboration was administrative. The historiography of that collaboration opened systematically only after the death of the wartime generation and after the declassification of national police files in France in the 1990s is now exhaustive. The trains themselves were sealed freight cars. The route from Drancy to Auschwitz was 1,250 kilometers and took 3 days. There was no water on board, there was no food, there were no sanitary facilities. The deaths in transit were tallied at arrival by SS personnel and entered into the camp registry. Treblinka received approximately 60 transports between July and September 1942. Average load between 5,000 and 7,000 deportees per train, predominantly from the Warsaw Ghetto. The Warsaw deportations alone, between July 22nd and September 12th, 1942, moved approximately 265,000 people from the ghetto to Treblinka in 53 days. The operation was administered from the Umschlagplatz, the rail loading square at the northern edge of the ghetto wall. The Reichsbahn billed the SS. The SS paid out of expropriated Jewish assets. The Reichsbahn issued receipts. The receipts are at Bundesarchiv Berlin. From that ledger entry forward, the question for the planners at the RSHA was no longer whether the rails could carry the load, it was whether the receiving facilities could process what the rails were delivering. Auschwitz-Birkenau and the engineering of the killing facilities. Rudolf Höss was 41 years old. He was a methodical bureaucrat, a former Freikorps fighter, and a father of 5 who lived with his family in a 2-story villa 30 meters from the Auschwitz camp wall. His wife Hedwig described the years there, decades later, as the happiest of her life. The garden had roses, the children played on a swing. The villa stood within sight of the chimney. Höss commanded the camp from May 1940 until November 1943, and then again briefly in mid-1944 for the Hungarian operation. He took over the construction of Birkenau, the satellite camp 3 kilometers to the west, in late 1941. The construction office records survive almost completely. They are held at the Państwowe Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau in Oswięcim in the Zentralbauleitung file series. The construction drawings for Crematorium II were signed in January 1942 by 2 SS architects, Walter de Hacco and Fritz Ertl. The drawings show a half-buried building 67.6 meters long, with an underground chamber labeled Leichenkeller 1, ventilation ducts, an electric elevator to the cremation hall above, and 5 3-muffle cremation ovens. The drawings are explicit engineering documents. They were not destroyed. The Red Army recovered them in January 1945 and held them in Soviet archives until the 1990s. They sit today under file mark BW30/25 at the museum. The ovens were manufactured by Topf und Söhne, an engineering firm founded in 1878 in Erfurt that built brewery boilers and crematorium furnaces for German municipal authorities. From 1939 onward, the firm took SS contracts. The lead engineer was Kurt Prüfer. The firm's correspondence with the SS Central Construction Office at Auschwitz survives in approximately 400 files at the former company archive in Erfurt. The invoices specify capacity. Across the 4 Birkenau crematoria operating in the spring and summer of 1943, the stated processing capacity was 1,440 cremations per 24 hours. The number was an engineering specification on a typed page signed by company personnel. There is no need to imagine the figure. The figure was sold. The information was not missing. This is the part the post-war political settlement has had the hardest time integrating. On April 7, 1944, 2 prisoners escaped from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Rudolf Werber, born Walter Rosenberg, age 19, a Slovak Jew, Alfred Wetzler, age 25. They hid for 3 days under a woodpile prepared by other prisoners, then walked south into Slovakia. By April 25th, they had dictated a 33-page report to the Slovak Jewish Council in Žilina. The report described the camp layout, the rail spur, the selection process at the ramp, the killing facilities, and the operational tempo. It included floor plans drawn from memory. The Wetzler report reached Bratislava, then Switzerland in May 1944, then London, then Washington, then the Vatican by mid-June. The Hungarian deportations had begun on May 15, 1944. By the end of June, when the report's contents were being summarized in BBC broadcasts and in the New York Times, approximately 380,000 Hungarian Jews had already been moved to Auschwitz on 147 transports. A debate followed within the United States War Refugee Board and the United States War Department, recorded in the National Archives at College Park in the John Paler Papers and the Assistant Secretary of War files. The question was whether the rail lines from Hungary to Auschwitz should be bombed. The technical question was answered. American 15th Air Force B-24 Liberators from the airfields at Foggia in southern Italy were already striking the IG Farben synthetic oil works at Monowitz, 5 miles from Birkenau, on August 20th and September 13th, 1944. The bombs fell within visible range of the camp. The decision not to divert any sortie to the rail approaches or to the crematoria themselves was a policy decision taken at the level of the War Department and never overridden. The historian David Wyman documented the debate in The Abandonment of the Jews, published in 1984, drawing on declassified files. The information was not missing, it was received, filed, debated, and not acted on at that scale. This is what the suppression looks like in the documentary record, not destruction, not censorship. A structural outcome of how post-war institutions selected what to remember. The Allied prosecution at Nuremberg, opening on November 20th, 1945, structured its indictment around 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The persecution of the Jewish population fell primarily under Count 4. Count 4 was the newest count, the least developed in international law, and the count given the least courtroom time. The first major successor trial, dedicated specifically to the killing system, the Einsatzgruppen case before the United States Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, opened only in September 1947 and concluded in April 1948 with 24 SS commanders indicted, 14 sentenced to death, and 4 eventually put to death by the tribunal. The first West German Federal Prosecution Office dedicated to investigating the regime's crimes, the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen in Ludwigsburg, was not established until December 1, 1958. Its founding director was the prosecutor Erwin Schüler. The lag between the end of the war and that founding was 13.5 years. The record existed. The Nuremberg files were closed for a generation. The Operation Reinhard documents were partially in Polish hands and largely uncirculated outside Poland. The Wannsee Protocol was discovered in 1947 and published in German legal journals, but the first English-language history of the killing system that integrated the archive at full operational depth, Hilberg's 1961 volume, was rejected by major American university presses before it found a small Chicago publisher. The political and historiographic delivery of the documentary record lagged the documentary record itself by approximately 15 years on the early end and by 57 years for files like the Höfler telegram. The Auschwitz album would tell the story in another medium. In May or June 1944, 2 SAS men identified by photoforensic analysis as Bernhard Walter and Ernst Hoffmann photographed the arrival, selection and processing of Hungarian transports at the Birkenau ramp. They took 193 photographs. The album was assembled and given as a souvenir to an SS officer. A Hungarian Jewish survivor named Lili Jacob found the album in 1945 in a barrack at the Dora Mittelbau camp where she was recovering after liberation. She recognized her own family in one of the photographs. She kept the album for 35 years and donated it to Yad Vashem in 1980. It is now the central photographic record of an arrival sequence at the camp. There is no equivalent set from any other day. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, the Hungarian operation moved approximately 437,000 Jews on 147 transports. Of those, approximately 320,000 did not survive the selection on the ramp. The operational peak of the entire system was 8 weeks. Only when the Soviet 60th Army reached the camp gates on the afternoon of January 27, 1945, were the surviving 7,000 prisoners out of a registered population that had once exceeded 130,000, finally counted by people who were not their captors. Sonderaktion 1005, the death marches, and the regime's attempt to erase the evidence. On November 25, 1944, the SS Central Construction Office at Auschwitz issued a demolition order for Crematorium II, and the dismantling began the following morning under the supervision of the same engineering staff that had built it 33 months earlier. The order was a single typed page. It survives in the Zentralbauleitung file at the museum. The dismantling was systematic. The cast iron oven doors were unbolted. The roof beams were lowered. The electric elevator was pulled out. The underground chamber, Leichenkeller 1, was prepared for detonation. The walls were undermined with explosives. On January 20, 1945, the building was demolished at the foundation. Crematorium 3 was demolished in the same week. Crematoria 4 and 5 had been damaged in a prisoner revolt the previous October and were partially dismantled by November. The October revolt itself was led by members of the Sonderkommando, the Jewish prisoner work units forced to operate the killing facilities, who had smuggled gunpowder out of the IG Farben Union Werke munitions plant in handfuls hidden in matchbox-sized scraps of cloth. 4 young women involved in the smuggling, Ella Gertner, Regina Safferstein, Esther Weichblum, and Rosa Robota, were tried by the camp authorities and put to death by hanging on January 6, 1945, 3 weeks before the Soviet arrival. Their names entered the post-war record through the testimony of fellow prisoners who survived. The regime was erasing a building. It was not erasing the file. The file was sitting in the same office. The demolition order was filed neatly next to the construction order. By the time the Red Army arrived, both were waiting. The attempt at erasure had begun 2.5 years earlier in the East. In June 1942, an SS staff officer named Paul Blobel, a former architect from the Rhineland and the former commander of Sonderkommando 4A within Einsatzgruppe C, was assigned a new and specific mission. The mission was designated Sonderaktion 1005. Its purpose was to revisit the mass grave sites of the 1941 and 1942 shootings in the East and to remove the evidence. The method was forensic. Prisoner work units, supervised by SS personnel, were forced to exhume the graves at Babi Yar, where the 33,771 killings of September 29th and 30th, 1941, recorded in Erignismeldung 101, lay in a single ravine. And at Ponary outside Vilna, at Brona Gora in Belarus, at Janowska outside Lwów, and at the disused sites of Treblinka, Bełżec and Sobibor after those facilities ceased operations. The exhumed remains were cremated on industrial pyres made of railway sleepers and steel grates. The ashes were ground in mechanical mills and scattered. The prisoner work units, having seen the operation, were generally killed at its conclusion. A small number escaped. One of them, a Vilna survivor named Motka Zeidel, gave detailed post-war testimony to Soviet investigators in 1944 and again to Israeli historians in the 1960s, describing the ankle chains, the wood pyres, and the SS personnel supervising the operation at Ponary. His testimony entered the Yad Vashem Oral Archive in Jerusalem. The operation continued sporadically into 1944. It is documented in the post-war trial testimony of Blobel's deputy and in the Nuremberg trial record. Blobel himself was tried in the Einsatzgruppen case and sentenced to death. The remains, in the regime's careful vocabulary, were the evidence. The vocabulary of the operation was itself a euphemism. The cover designation 1005 attached to the standing order rather than to its content. The order survives. The intention survives. The structures the operation tried to erase had been documented in the daily Erignismeldungen before the operation began. The erasure attempt was already, in the documentary sense, too late. As the front collapsed, the regime evacuated the camps westward. On January 17, 1945, with Soviet armor approaching the upper Vistula, the camp administration at Auschwitz issued an evacuation order. Approximately 56,000 prisoners were marched out on foot, in temperatures of -15 to -20 Celsius, in striped uniforms and wooden clogs. The columns moved west and southwest along the rail corridor toward Gleiwitz and Loslau. Those who fell were finished where they fell. Approximately 9,000 to 15,000 of the Auschwitz evacuees did not survive the first week. Similar evacuations from Stutthof, Gross-Rosen, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora in the following weeks brought the total figure for those who did not survive the evacuation marches between January and April 1945 to an estimated 250,000 to 375,000, the wide range reflecting how partial the record was kept in the chaos. The route from Auschwitz to Gleiwitz was 63 kilometers. The columns took 3 days. German civilians watching from the windows of farmhouses along the route reported the columns in post-war local history surveys conducted by West German prosecutors in the 1960s. The liberators arrived in stages, the Soviet 60th Army at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945. The US Third Army at Buchenwald on April 11th. The British 11th Armoured Division at Bergen-Belsen on April 15th. Brigadier Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services for the British Second Army, drove into the Bergen-Belsen compound that afternoon. His medical report, filed within 72 hours and held now at the Imperial War Museum, documented approximately 60,000 living prisoners, of whom roughly 14,000 would die in the weeks after liberation, despite Allied medical intervention. The report counted approximately 13,000 dead lying unburied at the moment of arrival. The British Army Film and Photographic Unit, on direct orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, filmed the camp between April 15th and 24th. The footage was shot by Sergeant Mike Lewis, Sergeant Bill Laurie, and others. It runs to several hours and was screened in Allied courtrooms within a year. It is held at the Imperial War Museum Film Archive. The decision to film was an evidentiary decision. The US Signal Corps did the same at Dachau on April 29, 1945, when the camp was reached by elements of the US 42nd Infantry Division and the US 45th Infantry Division. The Signal Corps footage carries the catalogue number SC219123. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, having walked through the Ohrdruf subcamp of Buchenwald on April 12, 1945, sent a cable to General George Marshall in Washington that day, requesting that congressmen and journalists be brought to the camps so that the documentary record would not later be subject to denial. The cable is at the U.S. National Archives at College Park. 2 named witness anchors carry this stage of the record into the post-war evidentiary corpus. Primo Levi, an Italian chemist from Turin deported to Auschwitz in February 1944, liberated on January 27, 1945, dictated his post-war account, Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man, to a Turin publisher within 18 months of his return. The first edition appeared in 1947. It was, at first, a small commercial failure. By the 1970s, it was the foundational European prisoner-survivor text. Levi died in 1987 in Turin. Kurt Gerstein, a Waffen-SS hygiene officer from the SS Technical Disinfection Service, travelled to Bełżec on August 18, 1942, to inspect the gas installations and the disinfectant supply chain. He returned shaken. On a Berlin-Warsaw train shortly afterward, Gerstein approached a Swedish diplomat, Baron Göran von Otter, in a sleeper compartment and described what he had seen. Von Otter reported the conversation to the Swedish Foreign Ministry. The report was filed and not transmitted onward. Gerstein, captured by the French in April 1945, dictated a longer written account in French and German that has come down to history as the Gerstein Report. He died in French custody in July 1945. His report, with annotations, was used as evidence at Nuremberg. Multiple copies survive at the National Archives at College Park and at the Bundesarchiv. What the demolition crews failed to erase and what the death marches failed to silence was already being collected by Allied prosecutors, by surviving witnesses and by the archivists of 3 armies into a body of evidence that no post-war settlement would be able to compress into a single sentence. Nuremberg, Ludwigsburg, and the long arc of a record that did not disappear. On November 20, 1945, in courtroom 600 of the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the prosecution placed into evidence the captured German documents that, by the 8-month conclusion of the trial, would fill 42 published volumes. The International Military Tribunal, sitting under 4 flags, indicted 24 senior officials of the regime. 12 were sentenced to death by the tribunal, of whom 10 were put to death by the tribunal on October 16, 1946, in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. The published trial record, known as the Blue Series, runs to 42 volumes. The supplementary record of the 12 successor trials conducted by the United States Military Tribunal between 1946 and 1949, the Green Series, runs to 15 further volumes. Among the 12 successor trials was the Einsatzgruppen case, United States versus Otto Ohlendorf and others, prosecuted by a 27-year-old American lawyer named Benjamin Ferencz. The trial opened in September 1947 and concluded in April 1948. 24 SS officers were indicted, 14 received the death sentence, 4 had the sentence carried out by the tribunal at Landsberg in June 1951. Ferencz, the chief prosecutor in that case, lived to age 103 and died in April 2023, the longest surviving Nuremberg prosecutor and a public advocate of international criminal law until his last year. Then came the long pause. In West Germany, the federal prosecution apparatus for investigating regime crimes was not consolidated until the establishment of the Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen at Ludwigsburg on December 1, 1958, under the prosecutor Erwin Schüler. The institutional gap was 13 years. The reasons are documented and structural. The Allied occupation prosecutions had run their course. The new West German civil service contained, in significant numbers, jurists and administrators who had served the regime. Hans Globke, the Nuremberg laws commentator, served as chief of staff to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer from 1953 to 1963 without prosecution. The Adenauer-era amnesty laws of 1949 and 1954 had closed thousands of lower-level cases. The popular West German appetite for further prosecutions was limited. What changed the trajectory was first the Eichmann trial. Adolf Eichmann had escaped to Argentina via the so-called rat lines in 1950, living under the name Ricardo Clement in the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando, working at a Mercedes-Benz plant. Israeli intelligence located him in 1960. He was abducted on May 11, 1960, flown to Israel on an El Al flight 9 days later, and tried in Jerusalem from April 11th to August 14th, 1961. The trial was televised internationally. 112 survivor witnesses gave evidence. The trial was the first global public reckoning with the killing system delivered through survivor testimony rather than through captured documents alone. Eichmann was convicted, sentenced, and the sentence was carried out in May 1962. The historian Hannah Arendt covered the trial for The New Yorker. Her published account in 1963 introduced the phrase that became, for better or worse, the most cited single line of post-war reflection on the perpetrators. Then came the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt, December 1963 to August 1965, prosecuted by the West German Attorney General Fritz Bauer. Bauer, himself a Jewish jurist who had spent the war years in Danish and Swedish exile, prosecuted 22 former Auschwitz personnel under German law. The trial generated a corpus of survivor testimony recorded on more than 400 hours of audio tape held now at the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt. The Ludwigsburg office continued. By 2024, it had opened approximately 7,800 preliminary investigations against approximately 172,000 individuals. The statute of limitations debates in the West German Bundestag in 1965, 1969, and 1979 progressively extended and finally abolished the limitation period for murder, allowing prosecutions to continue into the 2000s and 2000s. John Demjanjuk was convicted in Munich in 2011 at age 91. Bruno Day, a former Stutthof guard, was convicted at age 93 in Hamburg in July 2020. The historiographic record continued to expand. Hilberg's Destruction of the European Jews was published in 1961 and revised in 1985 and 2003. The intentionalist-functionalist debate among Christopher Browning, Hans Mommsen, Saul Friedlander, Yehuda Bauer, and others through the 1980s and 1990s established the structural mechanisms of how the killing system escalated within the regime's bureaucratic ecology. Saul Friedlander's two-volume Nazi Germany and the Jews, 1997-2007, integrated the perpetrator record and the victim record in a single chronological narrative. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, 1992, reconstructed the daily operational reality of a single reserve police battalion. In occupied Poland from the post-war interrogation files of its members. The archive continued to open. The Bletchley Park signals files, including the Höfler telegram, were declassified at the National Archives at Kew through the late 1990s. Peter Witter and Stephen Tyas identified the Höfler telegram in series HW16/23 in the year 2000. The Vatican wartime files of Pope Pius XII were open to scholarly research in March 2020. The Russian state archives have released portions of the captured German materials in stages since 1991, with the RGVA in Moscow holding extensive files on the Reich Security main office. The Yad Vashem Hall of Names in Jerusalem began its Pages of Testimony project in the 1950s. By 2024, approximately 4.9 million names had been collected, each on a single sheet of paper bearing a victim's name, date of birth, place of birth, last known address, and the signature of a surviving relative who submitted the page. The remaining gap toward the figure of 6 million is the work of further generations. Here is the third twist of the record. The granular historical reality of how 6 million Jews were systematically removed from Europe between 1933 and 1945 has not been in dispute among historians since the early 1960s. The Wannsee Protocol sits at the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts in Berlin. The Höfler telegram sits at Kew. The Werber-Wetzler report sits at Yad Vashem. The Auschwitz album sits at Yad Vashem. The Reichsbahn invoices sit at the Bundesarchiv Berlin. The 195 Ereignismeldungen sit at Bundesarchiv R58. The Topf und Söhne engineering correspondence sits at the former company archive in Erfurt. The Klaasfeld Memorial lists every French convoy by name. The British Army film of Bergen-Belsen sits at the Imperial War Museum. The US Signal Corps film of Dachau sits at the US National Archives. The record has not changed. What changes, across countries, across generations, across political moments, is its delivery, its prominence in school curricula, the depth at which it is taught, and the willingness of contemporary publics to read it at the resolution at which it was originally recorded. What that evidence proved was not where the killing took place, that was already known to the men who built the facilities, but how a state, a continent, and a generation had been organized around it. The Yad Vashem Names database holds a page submitted in 1956 by a survivor named Avraham Kalmanowicz for his sister Sarah Kalmanowicz, born in 1928 in the Polish town of Łuków, last known address the Łuków ghetto, deported in October 1942 on a transport routed to Treblinka. He filled out the page in pencil on a single sheet provided by the Institute in Jerusalem. Sarah was 14 years old. He was the only member of the family who returned. Pages like that one now number 4.9 million. The database is updated weekly. The work is not finished and was never going to be finished by any single generation. The systematic removal of 6 million Jewish human beings from Europe between 1933 and 1945 was not, in its time, an operation conducted in darkness. It was published in the Reichsgesetzblatt. It was administered out of the Interior Ministry. It was authorized in a one-page letter signed by Hermann Göring on July 31, 1941. It was coordinated at a 90-minute meeting in a villa on a lake. It was invoiced by the German State Railway at 4 Reichspfennig per kilometer per deportee. It was engineered by a firm in Erfurt that also built brewery boilers. It was photographed by SS personnel at the camp ramp in May 1944. It was filmed by British and American Army camera teams at Bergen-Belsen and Dachau in April 1945. It was tried at Nuremberg, in Jerusalem, in Frankfurt, in Munich, and in Hamburg, in courtrooms running from 1945 to 2020. The work of those who came after has been not to discover it, but to refuse the compression of it into a single sentence. Primo Levi, dictating to a Turin publisher in 1946, ended his account with the warning, paraphrased here, that what happened once can happen again, and that this is the central reason for telling it at the resolution at which it was lived. The villa on the Wannsee is now a museum. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.